Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we begin with a question. What if the craziest idea you ever had turned out to be the one that defined your life? This is the question that hovers at the heart of Phil Knight's story, the man who built Nike from nothing but a wild hunch and an unshakable drive. Shoe Dog is not a tale of tidy formulas or quick wins. It is a memoir of risk, fear, obsession, and the strange joy of refusing to quit even when the odds said you should. If you find this summary helpful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Booksnap, and comment below the title of the book you'd like us to summarize next. We'll make it happen soon. The story begins in Oregon, 1962. Phil Knight is 24, fresh out of Stanford with an MBA, and filled with restless energy. He doesn't know exactly what to do with his life, but he knows one thing with absolute clarity. He doesn't want the predictable path. Not the 9-to-5 desk job, not the safe paycheck, not the slow grind toward retirement. He calls his idea the crazy idea. It doesn't sound like much at first, importing running shoes from Japan. But for Knight, it feels like destiny, as if his entire life has been pointing toward this moment. The seed was planted years earlier. Knight was a runner, not a world-class athlete, but passionate enough to understand the soul of the sport. He ran at the University of Oregon under the legendary coach Bill Bowerman, a man obsessed with shaving fractions of a second off performance, who tinkered with shoes like a scientist at a lab bench. Knight had felt firsthand the limits of the clunky American shoes on his feet. When he learned of the sleek, light Japanese brands beginning to appear after the war, his imagination caught fire. Why couldn't these shoes challenge the German giants, Adidas and Puma? Why couldn't he be the one to bring them to America? But ideas mean nothing without action. And so, against logic, Knight decides to take a round-the-world trip, a personal odyssey before settling into adult life. He convinces his father, a practical man wary of his son's whims, to fund the journey. Knight sets out with nothing but a backpack, some traveler's checks, and the notion that somewhere along the way he might stumble into his future. The trip is transformative. He wanders through Asia, Africa, and Europe, absorbing cultures and histories that expand his sense of possibility. But it's in Japan that the crazy idea crystallizes. Sitting in his small hotel room in Kobe, he rehearses his pitch to Onitsuka, a shoe manufacturer making a brand called Tiger. Nervous but determined, he bluffs his way into a meeting with company executives. He tells them he represents a company called Blue Ribbon Sports. In truth, Blue Ribbon doesn't exist. It's just a name he conjured on the spot. Yet the executives are intrigued. The young American's enthusiasm convinces them to grant him a deal. He will become their U.S. distributor. At that moment, Knight realizes the line between dream and reality is thinner than he thought. With little more than confidence and a willingness to risk embarrassment, he has opened the first door. Returning home, he struggles to explain the significance to his father. Phil is not reckless in the way most people imagine. He studies balance sheets, sketches out models, prepares letters, but the truth is, no spreadsheet could prove this venture was sane. He is betting on instinct, and instinct alone. His father, skeptical but supportive in his own quiet way, agrees to loan him some money to place his first order. When the first shipment of Tigers finally arrives, Knight tears open the boxes like a child at Christmas. The smell of new rubber, the gleam of fresh designs, it is tangible proof that his dream has weight. He stacks them in his parents' basement where they wait for customers who do not yet exist. He carries them in the trunk of his Plymouth Valiant, driving to track meets, selling pairs to runners straight from the car. Every sale feels like a triumph. Every handshake with a customer feels like validation. Yet beneath the excitement lies fear. What if the shoes don't sell? What if Onitsuka changes its mind? What if the bank calls in the loan and the whole fragile thing collapses? Phil Knight will later describe this constant anxiety as the texture of entrepreneurship, the daily wrestling with doubt that never truly disappears. But in those early days, the fear is balanced by something stronger, a sense of mission. These shoes, he believes, are not just products. They are tools for freedom. They are weapons against mediocrity. They are symbols of the runner's spirit, lean and fast, chasing the horizon. And so, with each mile on the road, each trunk sale, each runner lacing up a pair of Tigers, Knight feels himself stepping deeper into the life he was meant to live. He doesn't yet know how brutal the journey will be. He doesn't yet know how many battles await him. With banks, with suppliers, with rivals, even with his own teammates. All he knows is that for the first time, he is alive with purpose. The crazy idea is no longer just an idea. It is the beginning of Nike's story, though the name Nike has not yet been spoken. And, like every true beginning, it feels both impossible and inevitable, like the first step of a marathon that will change everything. Japan, in the early 1960s, was not the powerhouse of technology and commerce it would later become. It was a nation still rebuilding, still hungry to prove itself. For Phil Knight, walking the streets of Kobe, the energy was palpable, a mix of tradition and fierce modern ambition. He saw the neon signs glowing in the humid night, the crowded train stations, the quiet shrines tucked between rising concrete towers. And somewhere inside this clash of old and new, he sensed his destiny stirring. He had rehearsed his lines again and again, sweating in his tiny hotel room, preparing for a meeting he had no right to secure. He was not a businessman. He was not backed by a corporation or investors. He was a young runner with a diploma, a wild idea, and the conviction that something small could grow into something enormous if given just the right chance. The company he wanted to meet was Onitsuka, makers of the Tiger shoe. When he finally sat across from their executives, he summoned a courage that surprised even himself. His voice shook slightly, but he pressed forward. He introduced himself as a representative of Blue Ribbon Sports. In truth, Blue Ribbon was nothing but a name he had scribbled down, a company without an office, without employees, without even a bank account. But in that room, with their sharp suits and curious glances, Knight let the name carry weight. He spoke of America's growing appetite for running, of the surge of interest in athletics, of a market hungry for lightweight, high-quality shoes. He explained that German brands like Adidas and Puma had dominated for too long, and that an opening existed for something new. He made America sound like a frontier of opportunity, and himself like the pioneer who could guide them through it. The executives leaned forward, intrigued. There was a pause. Then, to Knight's astonishment, they agreed to send him samples. He would become their distributor in the United States. As he left the meeting, Knight's heart pounded with exhilaration. He had walked in with nothing but a bluff and walked out with a partnership. The dream was now tethered to reality. He could see it, the shoes on American tracks, in American schools, changing the rhythm of runners' strides. It was no longer a crazy fantasy, it was a deal, fragile but real. Back in Oregon, Knight lived with his parents, the basement becoming his first warehouse. The first shipment from Onitsuka took months to arrive, and when it finally did, he opened the boxes with trembling hands. Sleek, light, unlike anything sold in America. The Tigers felt like contraband from the future. He laced up a pair, jogged around, and felt the difference instantly. These weren't just shoes. They were wings. Now came the hard part. Selling them. Knight was not a natural salesman, but passion gave him an edge. He drove his Plymouth Valiant to every track meet he could find, opening the trunk like a street vendor, showing off the shoes to coaches and runners. He talked about performance, about the thrill of shaving seconds off a race. He wasn't just peddling products, he was selling a dream of speed, of possibility. The reactions were encouraging. Runners loved the feel. Coaches noticed the improvement. Slowly, the word spread. Blue Ribbon Sports, once nothing more than a bluff in Japan, was now taking shape. Each pair sold put a few dollars in Knight's pocket, but more importantly, it gave him momentum. Still, fear shadowed him. He was in debt to the bank for the first order. He had no guarantee Onitsuka would continue to honor the deal. He had no cushion if the shoes didn't sell. Every box in the basement was a silent reminder of the stakes. If this failed, he would be broke, embarrassed, and back at square one. But failure, he told himself, was not the enemy. Standing still was. Better to burn out chasing something bold than to wither slowly in a safe, meaningless job. He remembered his world trip, the landscapes that had humbled him, the cultures that had widened his horizons. In every place he had visited, he had felt the fleetingness of time, the urgency of life. That urgency now fueled his every move. One day, while visiting his old coach Bill Bowerman, Knight handed him a pair of tigers. Bowerman studied them closely, his mind instantly racing with possibilities. He wasn't content to just wear them. He wanted to dissect them, improve them, reinvent them. In Bowerman, Knight had found not just a mentor but a partner whose obsession matched his own. Together, they began to imagine how far this small basement business might go. The journey to Japan had given Knight more than shoes to sell. It had given him a vision of himself as someone who could take risks, stand in foreign boardrooms, bluff his way into opportunities, and turn them into realities. It had shown him that the world did not belong to the cautious. It belonged to those willing to leap, even when the landing was uncertain. And so, with a trunk full of tigers and a heart full of restless ambition, Phil Knight set out on the road. Not just to sell shoes, but to chase the crazy idea until it became something greater than he could yet imagine. The first shipment was a test of faith. Brown cardboard boxes stacked in his parents' basement, the smell of fresh rubber wafting through the house like a silent promise. Phil Knight stared at them, torn between awe and dread. These shoes were real, tangible. But now came the true challenge, moving them, one pair at a time, into the hands of runners who didn't know his name or his dream. He loaded pairs of tigers into the trunk of his Plymouth Valiant. At track meets across Oregon, he became a salesman, though he never quite fit the part. There was no slick pitch, no rehearsed charm. He simply opened the trunk, lifted a pair, and spoke with the conviction of someone who believed these shoes could change a life. His passion became the pitch. He'd hold out the shoes like a priest offering communion, urging runners to feel the lightness, to sense the possibility stitched into every seam. And they responded. Young athletes, desperate for any edge, laced them up and felt the difference instantly. Some smiled in surprise, others nodded silently, already imagining their next race. Coaches noticed too. They asked questions, studied the soles, and saw something worth trying. Slowly, the word began to spread. The basement inventory trickled away, pair by pair, trunk by trunk. For Knight, each sale was more than a transaction. It was validation. It meant the crazy idea wasn't so crazy after all. He began to dream bigger. More orders, more customers, a real business. But along with the thrill came pressure. Every time he placed a new order with Onitsuka, the stakes rose. He was spending money he didn't yet have, leaning on the fragile goodwill of banks, praying the sales would keep pace. In those early days, Knight lived in a constant state of tension. By day, he worked a regular job as an accountant, steadying his finances and appeasing his father's concerns. By night and on weekends, he became the hustler, chasing runners, taking phone calls, packing boxes, mailing shipments. His mother helped fill orders, his father lent quiet support despite doubts. Blue Ribbon Sports was still just a name, but in the basement, it was beginning to breathe. Then came a moment that changed everything. Bill Bowerman, his old coach, called with an unexpected proposition. Bowerman had tried the tigers and was impressed. But he didn't just want to wear them. He wanted in. A partnership. For Knight, it was both thrilling and intimidating. Bowerman was a legend, a man whose obsession with performance had shaped generations of runners. To have him as a co-founder meant legitimacy, credibility, but it also meant Knight was no longer alone. He had someone at his side, someone who pushed as hard as he did, sometimes harder. Together, they formed a peculiar duo. Bowerman, the relentless tinkerer, often cutting open shoes, gluing pieces, experimenting like a mad scientist in pursuit of perfection. Knight, the dreamer with a quiet persistence, handling logistics, orders, and the ever-looming specter of cash flow. Their motivations were different, but their mission was the same: build better shoes, get them on the feet of runners, and let the results speak. Still, the fear never left. Every order stretched them thin. Banks hesitated to extend credit to a young man with no collateral beyond a garage full of foreign shoes. Onitsuka sometimes delayed shipments, leaving Knight scrambling to meet demand. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Would this collapse before it ever truly began? Would he wake one day to find himself buried in debt, his crazy idea nothing but an expensive mistake? And yet, every track meet reignited his hope. He'd watch a runner sprint down the lane in tigers, the shoes biting the cinder track, the athlete's face lit with determination. In those moments, Knight felt part of something larger. Not just commerce, but transformation. He was helping runners chase their best selves, one stride at a time. Blue Ribbon Sports began to attract others too. Not just customers, but kindred spirits. Friends, misfits, believers who saw in Knight's shaky enterprise a chance to be part of something unusual. They weren't there for salaries. There weren't any worth mentioning. They came for the spirit of it, for the adventure of building something from scratch, even if it looked like madness to the outside world. Phil Knight began to understand something about himself. He wasn't chasing wealth or status. He was chasing a feeling. The sense of being alive in pursuit of a vision that mattered. The shoes were just the vessel. The real product was belief. And as the boxes in his basement emptied, as word spread across running circles, Knight's belief grew too. The crazy idea had taken root. It was fragile, uncertain, underfunded, and constantly on the edge of collapse. But it was alive, and so was he. The company was still more dream than structure, but slowly Blue Ribbon Sports began to gather a tribe. They weren't polished executives or seasoned professionals. They were eccentric, stubborn, sometimes chaotic individuals who believed in Knight's vision enough to risk their own comfort. In truth, they resembled a band of misfits more than a company, but that was exactly what gave them energy. At the center was Bill Bowerman, whose presence gave Blue Ribbon credibility and an edge in design. He couldn't stop tinkering. His kitchen often smelled of glue and melted rubber as he experimented with new soles, slicing up tigers to see how they might be lighter, faster, stronger. He once put 2 shoes in his wife's waffle iron to test a new grip pattern, an experiment that would later become legendary. To Bowerman, every ounce of rubber mattered. Every stitch of fabric was a chance to shave seconds off a runner's time. He was not in it for profit. He was in it for performance, for the art of pushing human potential further. Then there was Jeff Johnson, one of the earliest employees, a man of relentless energy. Where Knight was reserved, Johnson was a whirlwind of ideas, letters, and phone calls. He would bombard Knight with pages of suggestions, marketing strategies, product improvements, motivational notes. He slept little, worked constantly, and cared for the company like it was his child. He built one of the first running stores for Blue Ribbon, painted signs by hand, wrote advertising copy, even mailed personal notes to customers. He understood something essential. People didn't just want shoes, they wanted to feel part of a movement. Johnson gave them that. The team was raw, inconsistent, sometimes maddening. They argued, disagreed, clashed over direction. But their shared obsession kept them moving forward. They weren't motivated by salaries. Most of them lived frugally, scraping by. They weren't motivated by fame. Nobody outside a small circle of runners even knew Blue Ribbon Sports existed. What united them was a stubborn belief in the crazy idea, a sense that they were building something larger than themselves. Meanwhile, Knight kept balancing 2 lives. By day, he worked as an accountant, his suits pressed, his demeanor professional. By night and on weekends, he became the head of a growing shoe company, taking orders, handling shipments, writing letters to Japan. The dual existence exhausted him. Friends wondered why he didn't just settle down, find a steady career path, build security, but Knight couldn't imagine it. The fire inside him was too strong. He was addicted to the challenge, to the feeling of chasing something impossible. As the sales grew, the basement filled and emptied in faster cycles. Demand outpaced supply, and Knight found himself constantly on the edge, ordering more shoes, begging banks for credit, stretching every dollar until it screamed. The numbers never added up neatly. On paper, Blue Ribbon often looked like it was failing, but in reality, the shoes kept moving, and the runners kept spreading the word. Growth came not as a steady climb, but as a series of leaps and near crashes, each one more daring than the last. There were moments of triumph that lit the way forward. At track meets, when runners wearing tigers shattered their personal records, Knight felt vindicated. When coaches placed bulk orders, he felt a surge of pride. And when strangers mailed in requests, saying they had heard about Blue Ribbon Sports from a friend of a friend, he felt a glimpse of what this could become. Still, the shadow of fear loomed. Every time Knight picked up the phone to call the bank, he braced for rejection. Every shipment from Japan was a gamble. Would it arrive on time? Would it clear customs? Would Onitsuka decide to cut him off? He lived with the constant sense that the whole fragile creation could collapse overnight. And yet, strangely, he thrived in that space between fear and faith. He began to understand that building a company wasn't about eliminating risk. It was about learning to live with it, to dance with uncertainty, to keep running even when the finish line was nowhere in sight. The ragtag team of Blue Ribbon Sports embodied that philosophy. They were flawed, overworked, underpaid, often half-crazy, but they were united by a shared obsession, and that made them unstoppable in their own way. Phil Knight looked around at his tiny company, the basement warehouses, the shoeboxes stacked to the ceiling, the eccentric partners scribbling ideas late into the night, and realized something important. He was no longer just a man chasing a crazy idea. He was now part of a tribe chasing it together, and that tribe, fragile as it was, might just be strong enough to carry Blue Ribbon Sports into a future none of them could yet see. The numbers were always tight. Every order from Japan meant another trip to the bank, another awkward meeting with men in suits who looked at Knight's balance sheets and shook their heads. On paper, Blue Ribbon Sports was constantly teetering. Sales were growing, yes, but the profits evaporated as quickly as they came, swallowed by the need for more inventory. The faster the shoes sold, the faster Knight had to beg for money to buy the next shipment. Growth, instead of easing pressure, only tightened the noose. He would sit across from bank managers, explaining with calm determination that Blue Ribbon was not a hobby, not a passing venture. He spoke of the demand, of the track teams begging for more pairs, of the momentum that was building. But the bankers, conservative and cautious, rarely shared his vision. They saw only risk. A young man, no collateral, no safety net, asking for more and more credit. Sometimes they gave him just enough to survive. Sometimes they flatly refused. Each meeting was a battle for the very life of the company. Meanwhile, the team worked tirelessly, operating on fumes. Jeff Johnson opened the first retail store, a cramped space that smelled of sweat and rubber, where every sale was personal. He wrote newsletters, sent handwritten notes to customers, treated each runner as if they were family. His obsession kept the fire burning when Knight was overwhelmed with finances. Johnson lived like a monk, pouring every ounce of energy into the mission. Knight sometimes found his endless letters overwhelming, but deep down, he knew Johnson's passion was one of Blue Ribbon's greatest assets. Then there was Bowerman, continuing his experiments in his garage, cutting, gluing, reshaping. He was convinced shoes could still be lighter, faster, more efficient. His mind was never still. He badgered Knight to push Onitsuka for better designs, for innovations that might shave seconds off performance. Bowerman didn't care about margins or sales reports. He cared only about progress. Knight admired his intensity, even when it drove him mad. Together, their dynamic created a strange alchemy. Knight the cautious dreamer, Bowerman the relentless tinkerer, Johnson the restless evangelist. But no matter how strong the spirit, money remained the constant enemy. Knight worked as an accountant to keep himself afloat, living modestly, funneling every extra dollar back into Blue Ribbon. The dual life exhausted him. His days blurred together, numbers at the office, shoes at night, letters from Japan, pleas to the bank. He often wondered how long he could sustain it, how long before exhaustion or debt broke him. Yet every time he considered stepping back, he remembered the runners' faces, the way they lit up when they tried the shoes, the way they believed. That belief, fragile and fleeting, kept him moving forward. The pressure mounted as demand soared. Runners across the country began hearing about Tigers. Word spread through athletic circles. Coaches ordered in bulk. Customers wrote letters asking for pairs. Blue Ribbon could not keep up. Boxes flew out of basements and back rooms as quickly as they arrived. And still, Knight had to fight the banks for every dollar needed to place the next order. The relationship with Onitsuka, too, was fraught with uncertainty. At times, the Japanese executives seemed supportive, sending shipments and entertaining Knight's requests. At other times, they grew distant, evasive, hinting that they might give distribution rights to someone else. Knight lived with the constant fear that Onitsuka would cut him out, leaving him stranded with nothing. It was a delicate dance, one he had to play perfectly, even as he bristled at the lack of control. The struggle wasn't glamorous. There were no headlines, no trophies, no cheering crowds, just long hours, anxious nights, and the ever-present specter of collapse. And yet, hidden inside the grind, there was a strange joy. Knight began to see himself differently. He wasn't just selling shoes. He was chasing something deeper. Freedom. Freedom from the safe, predictable life that had always seemed to suffocate him. Freedom to create something lasting, something that mattered. He once described it as a runner's high, that sense of effort and pain blending into exhilaration. Building Blue Ribbon Sports felt the same. Every challenge, every setback, every sleepless night was part of the race, and the finish line, though invisible, pulled him forward. In those years, Knight learned one of the most painful truths of entrepreneurship. Growth is a paradox. It feels like progress, but it magnifies every weakness. It creates opportunity and scarcity at the same time. It makes you look successful to the world while leaving you more fragile than ever inside. Still, he pressed on. Blue Ribbon was fragile, but alive. The team was overworked, but committed. The dream was distant, but burning brighter each day. Knight knew he was playing with fire, that a single misstep with the banks or Onitsuka could ruin him. But he also knew this: he could not stop. He would not stop. The crazy idea had become a way of life, and there was no turning back. Growth was supposed to feel like success, but for Phil Knight, it often felt like standing on quicksand. Each year, Blue Ribbon Sports sold more shoes, attracted more customers, and gained more attention in the running community. And yet, every victory seemed to come chained to a new crisis. Orders grew faster than the company's ability to pay for them. Banks, weary of Knight's perpetual requests, tightened their grip. Onitsuka, the Japanese supplier who had given him his start, grew more unpredictable, dangling the threat of pulling distribution at any moment. Knight lived in constant tension, juggling faith and fear. He would sit at his desk late into the night, surrounded by invoices, bank statements, and letters from Japan, feeling the weight of impossibility pressing on his chest. There were days when he wondered if he had made a mistake, if the crazy idea was too fragile to withstand the harsh realities of business. And yet, even as doubt gnawed at him, something deeper whispered, "Keep going." The reality of running a business was far from the romantic vision he had carried in his early days. There were no glamorous offices or glossy advertisements. Instead, there were warehouses that leaked, trucks that broke down, shipments that went missing. There were lawsuits over trademarks, constant battles with customs, and endless negotiations with suppliers. Each problem felt like a test designed to break him, to force him to quit. But Knight learned that entrepreneurship was not about avoiding problems. It was about surviving them. The partnership with Onitsuka began to sour. At first, the Japanese executives had treated Knight with curiosity, even trust. But as Blue Ribbon's sales in America surged, Onitsuka began to sense the value of the market. Rumors surfaced that they were considering cutting Blue Ribbon out and finding a bigger distributor. Knight wrote letters, pleaded for clarity, traveled back to Japan, only to be met with polite evasions. The ground beneath him felt unstable. Without Onitsuka, there would be no shoes to sell. Without shoes, there would be no company. The team, too, felt the strain. Jeff Johnson, as tireless as he was, often clashed with Knight over direction. Johnson wanted more resources, more focus on marketing, more attention to detail. Knight, juggling debt and uncertainty, often felt overwhelmed by Johnson's demands. Their letters, sometimes dozens of pages long, revealed both deep loyalty and simmering frustration. But beneath the arguments, there was a bond of shared purpose. Neither man was in it for money. Both were chasing something bigger, even if they disagreed on how to get there. Through it all, Bowerman continued his relentless experiments. He sent sketches, notes, and prototypes to Knight, always pushing for lighter, stronger, faster shoes. His vision was singular. Athletes deserved the best tools possible. One design in particular, inspired by his wife's waffle iron, began to show promise. Small squares of rubber pressed into the sole provided grip unlike anything on the market. It was crude at first, but Bowerman believed it could change everything. Knight tucked the idea away, sensing its potential. Meanwhile, the financial battles grew harsher. Each time Knight thought he had secured enough credit to survive, expenses ballooned again. He sometimes felt like a con artist, forever convincing banks to lend money on faith alone. He would walk out of meetings drenched in sweat, clutching loans that barely covered the next shipment, knowing he would have to return in months with the same desperate request. He lived on the edge of collapse, each step forward shadowed by the possibility of disaster. And yet, even as the reality grew harsher, the dream deepened. Runners across the country were winning races in Blue Ribbon shoes. Coaches praised their performance. Word spread to athletes Knight had once idolized, who now wore the very shoes he had fought to bring into the world. In those moments, Knight felt the power of belief made tangible. His company was fragile, yes, but it was real. It was shaping lives, one stride at a time. The tension between dream and reality became the defining rhythm of his life. By day, the dream seemed constantly at risk of implosion. By night, when he saw athletes racing in tigers, when he read Johnson's letters filled with passion, when he sketched out possibilities for the future, the dream felt unbreakable. Both truths existed at once. Phil Knight began to understand that building something meaningful was never clean, never easy. It was messy, full of contradictions, victories entwined with setbacks, hope entwined with fear. Blue Ribbon Sports was a company forever on the brink, and yet it was alive. And for Knight, that was enough. Better to live on the brink of disaster in pursuit of a calling than to spend a lifetime safe but unfulfilled. The dream was fragile, but so was life. And fragility, he realized, was no excuse to stop running. Excuse to stop running. Excuse to stop running. Excuse to stop running. The storm finally broke when the truth about Onitsuka could no longer be ignored. For years, Knight had lived under their shadow, dependent on their shipments, their whims, their promises. He had built Blue Ribbon on fragile trust, always suspecting betrayal but never quite ready to confront it. Then came the confirmation. Onitsuka was quietly courting other distributors, preparing to cut Knight out of the very deal that had birthed his company. It was betrayal, plain and sharp. Knight had gambled everything on this relationship, convinced himself that loyalty and performance would bind Onitsuka to him. Instead, they had seen his growth not as a testament to partnership, but as a signal to reclaim the American market for themselves. The crazy idea that had carried him this far was now in jeopardy of being ripped away. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm him. If Onitsuka severed ties, Blue Ribbon would be nothing but a hollow shell, a company without shoes. Years of sweat, sacrifice, and debt would vanish overnight. But inside, that despair burned something fierce. Knight realized he could no longer live as someone else's distributor. He had to create something of his own. Thus began the most dangerous gamble yet. The birth of Nike. The transition was not smooth. Blue Ribbon had to fight Onitsuka in court, a brutal legal battle that drained energy, money, and spirit. Knight, who hated confrontation, found himself staring across courtrooms, defending his fragile company against the giant who had once been his partner. It was a test of resolve, and the stakes were nothing less than survival. But while the lawyers fought, something more important was taking shape. The team began sketching out a new identity. They needed a name, a symbol, a story. In the haze of brainstorming sessions, one suggestion floated up: Nike, after the Greek goddess of victory. At first, Knight wasn't sold. It felt strange, unfamiliar. But the name lingered, sharp and simple with an echo of destiny. Victory. That was what they were chasing all along. Then came the swoosh. A young graphic design student was hired to create a logo. She produced a simple checkmark-like symbol, meant to suggest movement and speed. The fee was $35. At first glance, Knight wasn't thrilled. "I don't love it," he admitted, "but maybe it will grow on me." He had no idea that this small mark would one day rival the Golden Arches, the Bitten Apple, and every other icon of global commerce. Launching Nike was like leaping into the unknown. The shoes weren't just imports anymore. They were creations. Bowerman's experiments became prototypes, his waffle sole design molded into rubber, his obsessive pursuit of performance etched into every pair. The team scrambled to get factories moving, suppliers lined up, marketing in motion. They were inventing an identity while fighting for their very survival. The war with Onitsuka raged on. In court, the Japanese executives argued, threatened, maneuvered. Knight and his team countered with evidence, testimony, sheer stubbornness. It was David versus Goliath, except David was broke and exhausted, clinging to the belief that justice and persistence might tip the scales. Each hearing was agony, each ruling a temporary reprieve. But amidst the chaos, something remarkable happened. Runners began to lace up Nikes. They tested the new designs, felt the lightness of the waffle soles, the grip, the speed. Slowly, word spread. Athletes noticed. Coaches took interest. A new brand was being born not in glossy ads or corporate boardrooms but on the cinder tracks of America. One stride at a time. Knight realized that the betrayal, as painful as it was, had forced him to evolve. Had Onitsuka remained loyal, Blue Ribbon might have stayed a small distributor forever, trapped in someone else's orbit. Instead, the rupture pushed him into independence, into risk, into becoming the creator of something truly his own. The war with Onitsuka was not just a legal battle. It was a spiritual one. It forced Knight to ask himself whether he truly believed in his vision, whether he was willing to stake everything on it, whether he could step out of the shadow of the crazy idea and make it a reality. The answer came not in words but in action, in the swoosh, in the name Nike, in the shoes that carried athletes across finish lines. By the time the dust settled, the company was battered but alive. Onitsuka was gone. Nike remained. For the first time, Phil Knight stood not as a distributor, but as the founder of a brand that could shape the future. It was a rebirth, forged in betrayal and battle. The old Blue Ribbon was gone. In its place stood Nike, a name that meant victory, a swoosh that meant movement, and a team that meant everything. The swoosh began to appear where once only tigers had stood. It was faint at first. A new logo stitched onto shoes that still looked rough, still carried the smell of experimentation. But slowly, word spread that something different was happening. Nike wasn't just another brand. It carried an energy, a pulse that runners could feel when they laced up the shoes and hit the track. Bowerman's waffle sole, born from that kitchen experiment, became the breakthrough. The grid pattern gave traction like nothing else, gripping the ground with surprising lightness. Runners felt it immediately. They said the shoes almost pushed them forward, like a subtle engine in the soles. Performance was no longer a promise. It was reality. Coaches noticed. Athletes started to switch, sometimes quietly, sometimes defiantly, abandoning the old giants, Adidas, Puma, for this strange newcomer with a checkmark logo. Marketing wasn't polished. There were no glossy magazine spreads or celebrity endorsements yet. Instead, there was grit. Nike's identity grew from word of mouth, from sweaty runners whispering on cinder tracks, from college athletes who wanted any edge they could get. The swoosh spread through whispers, through races won, through records broken. It wasn't advertising, it was proof. Inside the company, the energy shifted. Blue Ribbon had been about survival, about scraping by. Nike was about possibility. Knight and his team began to think not just about selling shoes, but about shaping culture. They imagined Nike as a symbol for anyone chasing excellence, anyone daring to push further than the world thought possible. The swoosh wasn't just a mark. It was a call to movement, to ambition, to belief. Still, victory was never easy. The company remained strapped for cash, always one bad quarter away from collapse. Factories struggled with quality. Orders sometimes arrived late or defective. Competitors mocked the upstart. Yet every obstacle seemed to fuel the team's resolve. They were underdogs, and underdogs fight harder. Knight often reflected on how fragile it all felt. The lawsuits with Onitsuka still drained him. The banks still pressed for repayment. The numbers never looked safe. And yet, every time he saw a runner flying down a track in waffle soles, every time he saw the swoosh flash by like a stroke of lightning, he knew they were onto something unstoppable. Then came the athletes who would etch Nike into history. Steve Prefontaine, bold, fearless, almost reckless in his running, became one of Nike's first true ambassadors. Pre-embodied everything Knight wanted Nike to stand for: defiance, passion, obsession with pushing limits. When he ran, he wasn't just competing. He was declaring war on mediocrity. And on his feet were Nikes. His connection to the brand gave it a soul, a face, a story that no advertisement could match. As Nike grew, so did its culture. It wasn't just a shoe company anymore. It was a rebellion against the giants of the industry. Adidas and Puma were orderly empires with rules, traditions, and glossy images. Nike was scrappy, chaotic, a band of believers who refused to play safe. They embraced risk, embraced failure, embraced the messy process of creation. To work at Nike was to join a family where passion mattered more than polish, where running faster mattered more than looking good on paper. The swoosh, once dismissed as too simple, began to take on meaning. It became shorthand for movement, energy, victory. It became the rallying cry for athletes who believed in going beyond. For Knight, it was still surreal. $35 had bought a symbol that was now appearing on tracks across the country, carried by athletes whose names were being etched into history. Nike's rise was not smooth, but it was undeniable. From basement orders to global tracks, from a bluff in Japan to the swoosh on podiums, the company had crossed a threshold. The dream was no longer just Knight's. It belonged to every runner who laced up, every coach who believed, every employee who gave more than they had to give. The swoosh was no longer just a mark on a shoe. It was a flag planted in the ground declaring that Nike was here, and it was here to stay. Success arrived in flashes, not parades. A college kid winning a 10,000-meter race in waffle soles. A coach ordering carton sight unseen because his athletes kept asking for the new ones with the funny bottoms. A small ad taped in a shop window that drew a line out the door on a Saturday morning. Nike felt less like a company and more like a current. You stepped in, and it carried you forward whether you were ready or not. Phil Knight watched the numbers jump quarter after quarter, watched the warehouse empty faster than it filled, watched the swoosh turn from an experiment into a signature. He told himself to breathe. He rarely did. The Cortez fight ended with a verdict that felt like oxygen. Years of anxiety with Onitsuka were finally sealed by law, and the name Cortez stayed with Knight's side of the split. It wasn't just a legal win, it was a statement that Nike could protect what it built. Shoes rolled off lines with the new identity. The label on the tongue said what Knight could now say out loud without flinching. This is ours. Orders multiplied. Track programs called. Retailers who once ignored Blue Ribbon returned with polite voices and open purchase orders. The company still scraped for cash, still begged for terms, but a foundation had set beneath the chaos. Amid the climb, a single athlete gave the brand a face. Steve Prefontaine ran like he had a score to settle with the universe. No pacing, no calculation, just a dare to anyone who lined up beside him. He wore Nike because Nike fit his own refusal to compromise. Pre helped sell shoes, yes, but more than that, he sold belief. When he walked into a high school gym to talk with kids about running, the room leaned forward. When he laced up, the track seemed to tilt toward him. Knight saw the company's ethos inside that gate. Make your move and live with it. Then the phone rang. The voice on the other end carried the words slowly, as if saying them too quickly would make them untrue. A car accident in Eugene. Pre was gone. Knight sank into a silence that felt like cold water. The next day he drove with others to the place on the road where the rock still holds flowers. They stood with nothing useful to say. At the memorial, Knight watched the faces of runners who had built their identities around the way Prey attacked a final lap. He understood that a brand could be a vessel for grief as much as for pride. Work did not stop. Orders still had to be packed. Containers still had to clear customs. But each task now carried a weight. Bowerman moved like a man holding two ideas at once. Keep the kids fast, and say goodbye to one who had run as if time itself were the rival. He went back to his notes and kept tinkering because that was how he spoke when words failed. He cut another sole, shaved another ounce, wrote another instruction to a factory that struggled to keep up with his sketches. Grief turned into fuel, and fuel turned into new product. Cash was the same old cliff. Growth looked spectacular to the outside, but inside the ledgers the math still punished ambition. Nike leaned into relationships that could float the risk. A trading house that understood velocity better than a local banker did agreed to front inventory against future sales. The arrangement was complicated, sometimes humiliating, always necessary. Knight signed terms that left him little sleep, yet gave him time. He preferred the risk of momentum to the safety of stagnation. That preference became policy. The culture hardened. New hires walked in expecting a neat org chart and found a storm. People wore too many hats, argued too loudly, worked too late, cared too much. Mistakes were corrected in real time. Good ideas survived without ceremony. Bad ideas died quickly. The company was not polished. It was honest. Make it better became a reflex rather than a slogan. In meetings, someone always asked what the runner would feel. If the answer was nothing, the idea went back on the table or into the trash. Factories missed specs, so Nike sent people to stand on lines until quality held. Shipments missed deadlines, so teams drove through the night to stage product at events before the starter pistol. Retailers demanded credit and returns. Nike negotiated, appealed, occasionally swallowed the loss to protect the long game. Competitors noticed the rise and lowered their shoulders. Contracts were dangled in front of athletes already wearing the swoosh. Lawsuits flickered at the edges. It all cost money and time. It did not stop the climb. At home, the pressure made a different kind of noise. Family dinners took place beside a ringing phone. Vacations were measured in half-days between urgent calls. Knight tried to be present and often failed. He envied people who could separate work and life, who could clock out and let the mind go quiet. His mind did not quiet. It replayed forecasts and factory schedules and cash flow timing in endless loops. He ran in the mornings because running was the only place the loops loosened. The rhythm of footfalls gave him a boundary when nothing else did. Victories still arrived. A collegiate championship won by athletes and waffle trainers. A retailer who doubled their floor space for Nike. A letter from a high school kid describing how his first race in Nikes felt like leaving gravity behind. Each win landed with the same paradox: joy and cost. To serve the next surge of demand, the company would need more molds, more rubber, more credit. Growth expanded the horizon and the bill at the same time. Knight accepted the double-edged nature of the game. Want the result, accept the toll. On certain evenings, he drove past the track in Eugene and stopped. He would sit in the car and think about the price. Pre's rock. Friendships strained by the grind. Employees worn down by months of sprints stacked end to end. He did not romanticize any of it. He simply waited and then returned to the office. The mission had not changed. Make shoes that help humans run beyond themselves. Everything else was logistics and endurance. Inside the product pipeline, a new idea took hold. Cushion that returned energy without deadening the foot. Engineers and tinkerers traded foam densities, talked in grams and durometers, tested prototypes on weekend runs, came back with blisters and data. The shoes improved. So did the stories told about them. Early marketing began to sound like a whisper from the part of the brain that wants more from the body. Not instruction, permission. No shouting, no bullet points. Just images of people moving into a horizon with no finish line in view. Knight sensed the company crossing an invisible line. They were no longer asking for a seat at the table. They were building their own table and inviting the restless to sit. The swoosh had become a shorthand for a specific appetite, to see what happens if you give yourself fully to the work. It was a victory. It was also a responsibility that pressed down on everyone wearing a Nike badge. You cannot ask athletes for all they have and then give them a product or a brand that does not do the same. By the end of that run of years, the ledger showed numbers that would have stunned the kid selling shoes out of a trunk. The balance sheet still looked like a high-wire act. That tension felt permanent now. Nike was both, thriving and threatened, confident and anxious, victorious and grieving. Knight learned to hold those truths in the same hand. The success he had sought since his 20s was here, but it arrived braided with loss. He carried both strands forward, and in the quiet after midnight, when the last call ended and the last box was taped shut, he sometimes returned to the same interior question that had followed him since the crazy idea first found him. Is the cost worth the run? The morning always answered for him. He laced up, stepped outside, and moved. The decision to go public was not born from ambition alone. It was born from necessity. By the late 1970s, Nike had grown too large to be funded by bank loans, Japanese trading houses, or the stubbornness of its founder. Demand was outpacing supply at a scale that frightened even Knight. Factories were stretched. Creditors circled. Every month felt like a sprint to cover obligations with revenue that would only arrive if the next shipment cleared customs, if the next retailer paid on time, if the next batch of shoes sold. The cycle had become unbearable. The only way forward was to raise capital on a scale he had once sworn he would never seek: the stock market. Knight hated the idea. Going public meant giving up secrecy, exposing the company's guts to strangers, inviting analysts and shareholders to demand numbers and explanations. Nike had always thrived in chaos, in freedom, in a culture where people worked because they believed, not because a quarterly report demanded it. Knight feared Wall Street would never understand the company's soul. And yet he also knew that without an influx of capital, the very soul he wanted to protect would be strangled by debt. The preparation was grueling. Accountants scrubbed the books, lawyers drafted documents, bankers rehearsed presentations. Knight stood in rooms full of suits, pitching the very thing he had once sold out of a car trunk. He spoke of Nike's growth, its dominance in track and field, its new ventures into basketball and tennis. He spoke of innovation, of culture, of athletes who believed in the swoosh as more than a logo. Some investors leaned forward, intrigued. Others smirked, skeptical. To them, shoes were just shoes. Tonight, they were proof that belief could be manufactured and worn. On the day of the IPO, Knight felt a strangeness settle over him. Years of risk, fear, lawsuits, and sleepless nights had led to this moment. Shares of Nike, Inc. were offered to the public. The price surged. Within hours, the company that had once been nothing more than a bluff in a Japanese hotel room was valued in the tens of millions. Knight's personal net worth leapt higher than he could process. For the first time in his life, money was no longer the constant enemy. The banks would stop calling. Creditors would be repaid. Survival, at least financially, was no longer in question. But triumph carried an odd hollowness. Knight felt no urge to celebrate, no rush of champagne-soaked euphoria. Instead, he felt tired. Decades of living on the edge had wired him to expect the next disaster, the next betrayal, the next desperate scramble. Now, with a sudden abundance of capital, he felt adrift. The crazy idea had grown into a global company, but what was he chasing now? Survival had always been the fuel. With survival secured, the question of purpose returned, sharper than before. Inside the company, the IPO brought both relief and new tension. Early employees who had worked for scraps, living off passion and belief, suddenly found themselves holding stock worth small fortunes. Some celebrated. Others grew uneasy, unsure what to do with sudden wealth. The culture, once defined by shared sacrifice, began to shift. The underdog mentality, the Band of Brothers chaos, was harder to maintain under fluorescent lights and corporate scrutiny. Knight sensed it, mourned it, but knew it was inevitable. Growth changes everything. Externally, Nike's profile exploded. Retailers took them more seriously. Competitors bristled. The swoosh appeared not just on running tracks but on tennis courts, basketball courts, even in television ads. The company moved from the margins of sport into the heart of it. Athletes of global renown signed contracts. Endorsements multiplied. Nike was no longer a whisper among runners. It was a roar across the sports world. And yet, even as Knight watched his company climb into the stratosphere, his mind returned often to the basement, to the smell of rubber and the trunk of his Plymouth. He remembered the fear of the first order, the thrill of the first sale, the fragile joy of the first handshake with a customer who believed. Those memories anchored him, reminded him of what the money could never buy, the feeling of running toward something larger than yourself, uncertain if you would make it, but unable to stop. Going public did not end the race. It simply changed the terrain. Now the stakes were higher, the spotlight brighter, the risks more visible. Shareholders would expect results. Competitors would fight harder. The media would scrutinize every stumble. Knight knew the pressure would never end, but he also knew he had crossed another threshold. Nike was no longer fragile. It was formidable. And with that came the responsibility to prove that the swoosh was not just a symbol of past victories, but of future ones too. When the closing bell rang and Nike's stock settled into the market, Knight allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. He thought of the goddess the name invoked. Victory, not the kind found in quarterly earnings or stock valuations, but the kind runners feel when they push past the point of exhaustion and discover they can go farther still. That was the victory he wanted Nike to represent, and that was the victory he resolved to keep chasing, no matter how many billions lay in the bank. Looking back, Phil Knight doesn't tell his story like a neat business case. He doesn't frame it as a formula for success or a manual for entrepreneurs. He calls it what it was, a journey of a shoe dog, someone obsessed, perhaps unreasonably, with the craft, the grit, the smell of rubber and sweat, the life inside every step of a runner chasing the finish line. The victories are undeniable. Nike grew from a basement full of boxes to a global giant. The swoosh became one of the most recognized symbols on Earth, stitched not only on the shoes of runners but on the jerseys of champions across every sport. From basketball courts to Olympic tracks, from tennis matches to city streets, Nike became part of the culture. The IPO made Knight and his team wealthy beyond imagining. The world called it triumph. But Knight does not remember triumph first. He remembers fear. The late nights staring at ledgers, wondering if payroll could be met. The banks that nearly shut him down. The betrayal of Onitsuka. The grief of losing friends. The endless tension between growth and collapse. He remembers the sensation of running at full speed with the ground crumbling beneath him, never knowing if the next step would hold. That, more than the wealth, defined what Nike became. He also remembers the people. Bowerman, the coach who tore shoes apart and rebuilt them, who saw athletes as experiments in potential. Jeff Johnson, relentless and fanatical, who willed customers into believers with handwritten notes and obsessive care. The ragtag team who worked without glamour, who sold shoes from trunks and warehouses, who sacrificed comfort for a chance to be part of something alive. And the athletes, runners like Pre, who gave Nike not just exposure but soul, who showed the world that the swoosh was not about corporate polish but about defiance, passion, and the will to endure. For Knight, the lessons are not about business in the narrow sense. They are about life. That there is no formula for risk. That growth always feels like fear. And if it doesn't, you're not pushing hard enough. That loyalty matters more than contracts, and belief matters more than numbers. That the world does not reward caution the way it rewards boldness. He reflects on the strangeness of it all, how the crazy idea he pitched in a Japanese boardroom, armed with nothing but nerve, became a global brand. How a swoosh drawn for $35 became a cultural icon. How every near-death experience of the company taught him to run faster, think sharper, believe deeper. How the constant edge of collapse gave him purpose more than security ever could. In the end, Knight frames his life not as a tale of strategy but as a runner's story. You line up at the start not knowing if you can make the distance. You feel the pain, the doubt, the temptation to quit. You push anyway, and when you cross the line, you realize the race was never about winning in the eyes of others. It was about discovering what you had inside and giving all of it. He leaves his readers with the truth he carried. Life is growth. Growth is risk, and risk is never comfortable. But discomfort is the path. If you seek a sure thing, you'll never move. If you run toward the unknown, you might stumble. You might bleed, but you might also fly. Nike was never just about shoes. It was about the spirit of that chase, the refusal to stand still, the hunger to go farther. That is the legacy Knight claims for himself, and the reason he calls himself, with pride, a shoe dog. A shoe dog. A shoe dog. A shoe dog.